This is a True Crime New Crime Report. The latest on new cases we're following at True Crime Today and the Hidden Killers podcast.
On March 25th, 2025, a decision was made by the United States government that thrust the case of Luigi Mangione into the national spotlight, igniting a firestorm of legal and ethical debate. Attorney General Pam Bondi officially authorized federal prosecutors to pursue the death penalty against Mangione, a move that immediately transformed what was already a highly charged murder case into a pivotal moment in the ongoing discourse surrounding capital punishment in America. The gravity of this decision cannot be overstated, particularly given the backdrop of the recently concluded federal execution moratorium under the Biden administration. Mangione stands accused of the brazen daylight shooting of Brian Thompson, the CEO of UnitedHealthcare, on a bustling Midtown Manhattan sidewalk. Federal authorities are now characterizing this act not as a spontaneous outburst of violence, but as a meticulously planned act of domestic terrorism, a designation that carries significant legal and societal implications. This case transcends the typical courtroom drama. It represents the inaugural test of the Trump administration's renewed commitment to federal executions. The lifting of the moratorium has paved the way for cases like Mangione's to be considered under the harshest penalties available under federal law. For some, the government's stance is a clear indication of justice being served, a necessary response to a heinous crime. However, for others, it raises concerns about the potential for political maneuvering, with the government seemingly leveraging a volatile criminal case to make a broader statement about its stance on law and order. Regardless of one's perspective, the message emanating from this decision is unmistakable. The federal death penalty is back in play, and Luigi Mangione has become the central figure in a narrative that intertwines ideology, violence, and the deeply entrenched divisions within the American healthcare system. It is crucial to emphasize that Luigi Mangione has not been convicted of any crime. He has entered a plea of not guilty to both the state and federal charges leveled against him, and the legal proceedings are still in their nascent stages, with the trial yet to commence. The Attorney General's authorization to seek the death penalty, however, has irrevocably altered the landscape of this case. Mangione, who initially faced the possibility of life imprisonment if found guilty, now confronts the specter of federal execution. This development is particularly noteworthy given that it is occurring in New York, a state that has not carried out an execution since 1963, highlighting the stark contrast between state and federal legal frameworks on this issue. The question then arises, how is it legally permissible for federal prosecutors to seek the death penalty in a state that has abolished it? The answer lies in the distinct jurisdictions of state and federal law. While New York State eliminated capital punishment over 2 decades ago, federal law operates independently. If a case meets specific criteria outlined in federal statutes, such as involving acts of terrorism, crossing state lines, or the use of certain weapons, the Department of Justice retains the authority to pursue capital punishment, irrespective of the policies of the state where the crime occurred. This is precisely the legal avenue being pursued in Mangione's case. According to the official statement released by Attorney General Bondi, the actions allegedly committed by Mangione were not merely violent. They were fundamentally ideological in nature. The killing of Brian Thompson was described as a politically motivated assassination, deliberately intended to intimidate and provoke. Adding weight to this characterization is the reported discovery of a manifesto among Mangione's belongings following his arrest. This document purportedly contains angry diatribes against the healthcare industry, railing against corporate greed and the role of insurance companies in denying essential care. Disturbingly, it also allegedly singled out Thompson as a symbol of everything wrong with the existing system. This manifesto is central to the narrative being constructed by the Department of Justice. The timing of the federal death penalty authorization, coinciding with the return of the Trump administration to the White House, appears far from coincidental. In January, the administration formally rescinded the federal execution freeze and issued a directive to the DOJ to aggressively pursue capital punishment in cases involving political violence, domestic terrorism, or high-profile victims. Mangione's case seemingly ticks all 3 boxes, making it a prime candidate for this renewed approach. However, the decision to seek the death penalty is not solely based on legal eligibility. It is also deeply intertwined with considerations of optics, timing, and the establishment of precedent. By aggressively pursuing execution in this case, the federal government is sending a clear and unequivocal message, not only to Mangione, but also to the broader public. The message is stark. Acts of violence committed in the name of political expression will be met with the most severe penalty available under the law. While this stance presents a seemingly clear line in the sand, the complexities of Mangione's case suggest that the reality may be far less clear-cut than the DOJ intends. A broader perspective reveals that this case exists at the intersection of complex issues: politics, ideology, and public perception. For a segment of the population, Mangione is viewed as a cold-blooded killer who must be held accountable for his actions. Conversely, others, rightly or wrongly, have begun to portray him as a figure of resistance against a system they perceive as unjust. This does not necessarily equate to condoning the alleged crime, but the fact that some are attempting to frame it as an act of defiance against corporate power complicates the narrative in ways that the Department of Justice must now confront. Mangione's legal team is actively working to challenge the government's narrative. Karen Friedman Agnifilo, his lead attorney, issued a forceful response to the death penalty announcement, labeling the DOJ's move as state-sponsored murder and accusing the federal government of exploiting her client for political gain. Agnifilo contends that the pursuit of the death penalty is not about achieving justice, but about creating a spectacle. She argues that the case is being weaponized to make an example of Mangione and to divert attention from deeper, systemic issues within the healthcare industry. Her statement, while claiming to protect against murder, the federal government moves to commit one, underscores the contentious nature of this legal battle. Agnifilo's legal strategy is becoming increasingly apparent. A key component is to reframe the case, shifting the focus away from terrorism and towards the realm of individual mental and emotional breakdown. She is constructing what is known as a mitigation defense, a legal approach designed to humanize the accused and argue against the imposition of the death penalty. This involves presenting a comprehensive picture of Mangione's background, motives, and mental state, often through psychological evaluations and explorations of his personal history and ideology, as well as the specific events leading up to the crime. The underlying principle of a mitigation defense is to persuade the jury that even if Mangione is found guilty, execution is not the sole, nor necessarily the most appropriate response. However, the battle being waged extends beyond the confines of the courtroom. At its core is a fundamental question: who has the authority to define the meaning and significance of this case? The Department of Justice, by labeling Mangione's actions as terrorism, seeks to shape public perception and frame him as a domestic extremist who used murder as a tool for political ends. This classification not only justifies federal intervention and the pursuit of capital charges, but also reinforces the idea that Thompson's death was not an isolated incident of violence, but a calculated message conveyed through lethal means. In contrast, the defense is advocating for an alternative narrative. They argue that Mangione's actions were the result of an individual overwhelmed by frustration, alienation, and a sense of being failed by a broken system. While not excusing or justifying the alleged crime, they contend that it does not meet the legal or moral threshold for terrorism. They assert that the government's use of this label is primarily aimed at bolstering its political agenda rather than serving the interests of justice. Caught in the middle of this legal and ideological tug-of-war is the victim, Brian Thompson. A father of two and the CEO of one of the nation's largest health insurance providers, his murder was a shocking and brutal event that unfolded in a public space. The federal government's desire to frame this case as a symbol is understandable, given the high profile of the victim and the nature of the crime. However, whether this framing will withstand legal scrutiny and resonate with public opinion remains an open question. Further complicating matters is the fact that, as of the current date, Mangione has not been formally indicted at the federal level. The charges are still at the complaint stage, indicating the Department of Justice's intention to prosecute but their yet-to-be-convened grand jury. This is expected to change in the near future. The authorization to seek the death penalty all but guarantees that a grand jury will be convened to issue a capital indictment, at which point the federal trial clock will officially begin ticking. Adding another layer of complexity is the jurisdictional issue. New York State's case against Mangione is already underway. He has been indicted, arraigned, and is currently involved in pre-trial motions. The state charges include first-degree murder, terrorism, and weapons possession. A conviction at the state level could result in a sentence of life imprisonment without parole. The state trial is anticipated to precede the federal one unless the federal government decides to intervene and expedite its proceedings. Legally, the Department of Justice has the option to request custody of Mangione and prioritize the federal trial. While this is not a common occurrence in dual jurisdiction cases, it is not without precedent. If the DOJ believes its case is stronger, more pressing, or of greater national significance, it could seek to move its trial to the forefront. However, such a move would likely raise significant political and procedural questions. In most instances involving overlapping state and federal charges, the state trial takes precedence. However, the fact that the federal case now involves the potential for the death penalty may alter the DOJ's strategic considerations regarding the timeline. The filing of a federal capital indictment will provide a clearer indication of which trial is likely to proceed first. Until then, both cases are progressing in parallel, creating a complex and somewhat unwieldy legal situation. As court calendars fill up, legal scholars and commentators are actively analyzing the case, with many pointing out its potential to test the boundaries of federalism. The notion that an individual could face federal execution for a crime committed within a state that has abolished capital punishment is causing concern among academics and civil rights advocates. Some argue that this represents an overreach of federal power, while others maintain that it is a necessary measure in cases of national importance. Ultimately, the outcome of this case will not be determined by academic debates, but by the proceedings in a courtroom and the decision of a jury. The narrative that prevails in that setting will dictate Mangione's fate, with the only two possible outcomes being execution or life imprisonment, either at the state or federal level. As the prospect of a capital indictment looms and the legal maneuvering intensifies, all eyes are on how the government will construct its case and how the defense will attempt to dismantle it. The immediate future will involve rapid developments, including grand jury proceedings, motion hearings, and potentially a debate over which jurisdiction, state or federal, will proceed to trial first. To fully comprehend the current trajectory of this case, it is essential to revisit its origins, the crime itself, the subsequent manhunt, the arrest of Mangione, and the moment when a seemingly straightforward criminal investigation transformed into a politically charged national issue. The sequence of events began shortly after 9 a.m. on December 4, 2024, when Brian Thompson, the CEO of UnitedHealthcare, left the Hilton Midtown in Manhattan. He was en route to a closed-door investor event focused on the future of healthcare markets, but never reached his destination. As Thompson walked along the sidewalk, a masked individual approached him at close range and fired a single, fatal shot to the head. The act was swift, targeted, and devoid of any overt commotion. No shouting, no struggle, just a precise execution carried out in broad daylight. The shooter then calmly mounted a bicycle, merged into traffic, and disappeared, leaving behind a scene of shock and disbelief. The murder of a CEO from one of the most powerful companies in the healthcare industry, occurring in the heart of Manhattan, sent shockwaves across the nation. Security protocols at major corporations were immediately heightened. Investor meetings were canceled or moved online, and executives across the country found themselves on edge. Within hours of the shooting, the NYPD released grainy surveillance footage of the masked suspect pedaling away through the Midtown streets, navigating traffic with an apparent familiarity with the area. A joint task force, comprising city and federal investigators, was quickly assembled. They meticulously reviewed every frame of security footage within a half-mile radius of the crime scene, searching for any clue that could lead to the identification and apprehension of the shooter. Their efforts yielded a crucial piece of evidence, a thread that would unravel the mystery over the next 5 days. Surveillance cameras captured the suspect entering a subway station, exiting several stops later, and eventually disappearing from view. However, through a combination of digital forensics, traditional police work, and an unusually high volume of tips from the public, investigators were able to reconstruct the suspect's movements. They traced purchases made with what were believed to be fake identification cards, analyzed cell phone data, and reviewed hotel records. This painstaking investigation culminated on December 9th, 5 days after the shooting, when Luigi Mangione was spotted sitting alone in a McDonald's in Altoona, Pennsylvania. An off-duty nurse, recognizing his face from a wanted flyer that had been widely circulated, contacted the local authorities. Officers entered the restaurant and arrested Mangione without incident. A search of his belongings revealed a 9mm handgun fitted with a suppressor, which ballistics testing later confirmed matched the weapon used in the Midtown shooting. Mangione was also found to be in possession of 2 additional magazines, a knife, duct tape, zip ties, several fake IDs, and a printed journal that appeared to outline his plans, motives, and grievances. According to law enforcement officials, the journal contained disturbing entries describing the healthcare system as an empire built on pain. It included phrases like delay, deny, depose, written alongside notations about different types of ammunition. The journal also contained passages that directly named Brian Thompson, as well as notes detailing travel plans to New York, surveillance points near the crime scene, and potential escape routes. Investigators concluded that the murder was not only premeditated, but also meticulously planned and executed. Following Mangione's arrest, the legal process moved swiftly in New York. A Manhattan grand jury indicted him on multiple charges, including first-degree murder in furtherance of terrorism and second-degree murder as an act of terrorism. He was subsequently extradited from Pennsylvania by air, first transported to New Jersey, and then transferred to Manhattan in a heavily guarded motorcade. At his arraignment, Mangione entered a plea of not guilty. In a notable decision, the court granted the defense's request for Mangione to wear civilian clothing instead of a jail uniform, a move aimed at preventing potential prejudice among future jurors. Despite this concession, Mangione appeared in court shackled and wearing a bulletproof vest, underscoring the seriousness of the charges and the security concerns surrounding the case. The courtroom was filled to capacity, the atmosphere was tense, and the proceedings were punctuated by the sounds of reporters' keyboards and the chants of supporters who had gathered outside the courthouse to voice their support for Mangione. As of March 2025, the New York State case is progressing at a faster pace than its federal counterpart. Judge Maxwell Wiley is presiding over the state proceedings, which are currently focused on pre-trial motions. The most critical legal battle at this stage revolves around the evidence seized from Mangione at the time of his arrest in Altoona, and whether that evidence will be deemed admissible in court. Mangione's defense team, led by Karen Friedman Agnifilo, is challenging the constitutionality of the Altoona arrest. They argue that Mangione was detained without a valid warrant or probable cause, asserting that the local police acted solely on the basis of a citizen's tip and a vague resemblance to a wanted flyer when they approached him in the McDonald's. The defense contends that the subsequent stop, questioning, and search of Mangione violated his Fourth Amendment rights, which protect against unreasonable searches and seizures. If Judge Wiley rules in favor of the defense on this issue, the implications for the prosecution's case could be significant. Key pieces of evidence, including the handgun, the journal, and the fake IDs, could be suppressed, meaning they would be excluded from the trial. While this would not negate the surveillance footage from New York or the witness accounts placing Mangione near the Hilton on the morning of the shooting, it would severely hamper the prosecution's ability to establish motive and premeditation. The absence of the murder weapon as evidence would also present a substantial challenge to their case. In addition to the challenge to the arrest, a separate discovery dispute is brewing. The defense has accused the district attorney's office of withholding crucial materials, specifically grand jury witness statements and data extracted from Mangione's electronic devices, which they argue are essential for preparing their defense. In a court filing, they pointed out that transcripts from 4 civilian witnesses had not been provided, despite earlier assurances from the prosecution. They also raised concerns about the timeline for receiving digital forensic reports from Mangione's seized devices. The DA's office has countered these accusations, stating that over 95% of the discovery materials have already been turned over to the defense, including police reports, surveillance footage, forensic evidence, and the results of ballistics and DNA testing. They acknowledged a delay in providing a few transcripts, but maintained that these were minor and had since been delivered. Despite the prosecution's assurances, the tone of the legal filings has become increasingly adversarial. The defense has requested the court to authorize Mangione to use a secure laptop within the detention center to review the extensive volume of digital evidence against him. The DA's office has opposed this request, characterizing it as an attempt to create custom accommodations and arguing that Mangione already has access to shared discovery terminals similar to other detainees. Judge Wiley has yet to issue rulings on these critical pretrial motions. However, a schedule has been set, with defense motions due by April 9th and the prosecution's response due by May 14th. Judge Wiley is expected to issue his rulings by June 26th. If the judge decides to suppress key evidence, the state's case will face significant challenges. Conversely, if the evidence is deemed admissible, the path to trial will become clearer, although a trial date has not yet been determined. Meanwhile, the federal case against Mangione is progressing at a slower pace. The federal charges include murder through the use of a firearm, interstate stalking resulting in death, and using a silencer during a violent crime, all serious offenses that are now potentially death-eligible following the Department of Justice's recent announcement. However, a procedural hurdle remains. The federal case is still based on a criminal complaint, and a formal indictment by a grand jury has not yet occurred. This is likely to change soon. With the death penalty now a possibility, the DOJ will need to present its case to a federal grand jury to secure a capital indictment. Once this happens, a decision will need to be made regarding the timing of the federal trial. The question is whether federal prosecutors will wait for the conclusion of the state trial or attempt to expedite their proceedings and bring their case to the forefront. Such jurisdictional conflicts are not common, but are not unprecedented, particularly in high-profile cases like Mangione's that have garnered national attention. For the time being, Mangione remains in custody at Brooklyn's Metropolitan Detention Center.
The neighborhood was picture perfect. Manicured lawns, kids riding bikes, friendly smiles exchanged over white picket fences. And then there was him, the guy who never made eye contact, the one who only left his house at night, dragging black trash bags to the curb, bags that sometimes twitched. He's just a little odd, they said, just keeps to himself, until the smell started. Until the missing pets turned into missing people. Until someone finally had the nerve to peek inside that basement window. And if they had only subscribed to True Crime Today Premium Plus on Apple Podcasts, they could have listened to Hidden Killers with Tony Bruschi ad-free. And before everyone else, they could have recognized the warning signs. They could have gotten out, but they didn't. And now, they're part of the next episode. Don't make the same mistake. Subscribe now to True Crime Today Premium Plus on Apple Podcasts.